Hello friends, I'm Dr. Vivek, and today I'm going to discuss criticism of William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth is a well-known figure in history of English literature, especially in Romantic age. The lifespan of Wordsworth is 1770 to 1850. This is the lifespan of William Wordsworth, and uh, and this is all about the criticism of William Wordsworth. So, lyrical ballad comes first. Lyrical ballads uh, was published in 1798, and the 1798 is very important because with this publication, the Romantic age starts, and this Wordsworth. Wordsworth Wordsworth attached a preface to this in the second edition of Lyrical Ballad in January 1801, known as 1800 editions. He wrote preface, Lyrical Ballad. Wordsworth and Coleridge both wrote Lyrical Ballads in 1798, and the preface was added in 1801, January 1801, though it was known as 1800 edition. So its preface is very important in context to the criticism of William Wordsworth, literary criticism. This preface was revised and enlarged in the later editions published in 1802 and 1815. That preface was revised, there was changes in that preface and enlarged in 1802 and 1815. The chief subject matters of the preface are poetic diction and Wordsworth theory of poetry. What is in this criticism? Basically, we are going to discuss two important things about the criticism of William Wordsworth. First one is poetic diction. Yes, dear friends, poetic diction and Wordsworth theory of poetry in reference to the criticism of literary criticism of William Wordsworth. These two things are two important things are there. First one is poetic diction and Wordsworth theory of poetry. Now we start with the new classical poetic diction. What is this new classical poetic diction is and how it is different from Wordsworth poetic diction? Poetic diction is basically means the spatial language. Poetic diction is basically mean that it's a spatial language in which poetry can be written. There are many ways in of writing poetry, and that it's all called poetic diction. The spatial language which is used to write poetry is called poetic diction. Thomas Gray, very important transitional writer, Thomas Gray believed that the language of the age is never the language of poetry. That's a very important quotation of Thomas Gray in reference to the criticism of poetic criticism of William Wordsworth. What Thomas Gray said, I quote, "The language of the age is never the language of poetry." It's just opposite of what William Wordsworth says. It says that language of the age is never the language of poetry. This diction was imparted from the characteristic usage of earlier admired poets like Virgil, Spenser, Milton, these classical writers. They propounded this theory that language is of the language of the age is never the language of poetry. Prominent characteristics of the 18th century poetic diction are its archaism and its use of recurrent epithets, Latinity, personifications of abstract and inanimate objects, and the use of circumlocutions and periphrases. These are the characteristics of neoclassical poetic diction. Uh, Wordsworth, in his preface to Lyrical Ballad, 1800 edition, attacked this notion of poetic diction. This notion of poetic diction, that is, the language of the age is never the language of poetry. This was criticized by William Wordsworth. That's a very important. Nobody has ever dared to uh, go against the classical writers, and even the new classical writers. But this person, William Wordsworth, was the first one that tagged that poetic diction, which is propounded by classical and neoclassical writers. Now, Wordsworth's observation of poetic diction. Now, what Wordsworth says about poetic diction, what his opinion, what his thoughts on poetic diction is, what his thought is, it was rather be an abuse of poetic diction than perhaps the poetic diction itself. Why it is so? I'll let you know. Self that Wordsworth disapproves in 1798 in the advertisement of Lyrical Ballad. It was rather abused. Why it is abused? That I'll discuss. Wordsworth wrote that in the reason for adopting a simpler diction for his poetry was that he wanted to ascertain how the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes could be adopted for poetic pleasure. But still, when his poetry was attacked by the conservative critics, he wrote preface to Lyrical Ballad. He says the opposite to Thomas Gray. What Thomas Gray says, the language of age cannot be the language of poetry. He says that he wrote this Lyrical Ballad to ascertain how this language of conversation affects, or how they take it, this middle or lower classes take it as how they get pleasure in reading poetry, these middle and lower classes, and he want to ascertain, he want to know. That's why he wrote Lyrical Ballads. And but the conservative critics, they criticized his poetry, this Lyrical Ballad. Then he wrote the preface to the Lyrical Ballad, that he says, in the preface he writes that the principal object in poems occurred in Lyrical Ballad was to choose incidents and situations from common life. He has chosen, in the Lyrical Ballad, he has chosen the incident and situations which belong to, which are associated to the common life, and to relate or describe them throughout in the selection of language really used by man. The language which is written in poems, that the language is the same as it was used by the common man, really used by man, and at the same time throw over them a certain coloring of imagination, so that ordinary things could be presented to the mind in an unusual way. There is a certain coloring of the imagination. Imagination is incorporated in writing of the poem, which is written in the common man's language, that could be presented in the mind in unusual way. He has chosen the language of low and rustic. The writer, the William Wordsworth, has chosen the language which is used by the low and rustic life people, because he says that in that condition, man being free from all outside influences, in that language used by the common man, this language is free from all influences of other other influences. It's real. They speak from their own personal experiences and convey their feelings and notions in simple and unelaborated expressions. The simple language, it's a simple expression. The feelings are simple and unelaborated expressions are used. That's why he's using the common man's language. Such a language is more permanent. He says the common man's language, or easy, simple language, is more permanent and far more philosophical than the usual poetic diction is, far more philosophical than the typical kind of language which is used by the classical and neoclassical writers. Keeping this view of language in mind, he attacked the usual poetic diction. In poetic diction, Wordsworth includes personifications, periphrases, inversion, antithesis, and other devices. He says that he has tried to adopt the language of the man and rejects personifications as an ordinary device to elevate the style. According to him, these devices are important, but he rejects personifications because it's an ordinary device to, it does not elevate the style of writing. That's why he rejects this device called personification. Wordsworth points out that as a natural corollary to his concept of poetic diction, the language of poetry does not differ materially from that of prose. He says there's no difference between prose and poetry, the language of prose and poetry, except with the reference to meter. Meter is the only device which makes different in the language of poetry and prose. He even says that some of the most interesting parts of the best poems will be found to be strictly the language of prose, which is well written. The most important lines, poems, are those who has written in the language of prose, which is well written. Wordsworth even admits the use of metaphors, figures when passion demands. Here's the question answer of this question, that abuse of poetic diction, how it is abuse of poetic diction. When passion demands the use of these, this is the reason. He says that when passion demands, you can use the metaphors and figures of speech. This is the reason why critics do not find Wordsworth's concept of poetic diction in any way different from neoclassical concept of poetic diction. There is no difference between the neoclassical poetic diction and the Wordsworth theory of poetic diction, because he says that you can use metaphors and figures when passion demands. Where he was lacking means in his writings. Rene Wallach observes that Wordsworth actually ends in good classicism. It's a good classicism. It's nowhere different from the neoclassical poetic diction. His concept of poetry, it's also important. The concept of poetry, according to Wordsworth, Wordsworth defines poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Very important definition of poetry by Wordsworth. He said poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and it takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. Earlier, it was the definition of poetry was spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, but it was added later on in this definition that emotions recollected in tranquility. How the poetry is generated originates. He says that a person is attracted, he moves by the beauty of nature or anything, any like flower or natural beauty, scenic beauty. When it emotions aroused, he does not start writing at that point of time. Though he was moved, he was attracted by that beauty, but he does not start writing poetry at that moment, at that point of time. But later on, after a period of time, a couple of days, he recollects those experiences, those feelings, those emotions that comes to his mind, and he contemplates on those feelings which attracted him. And when tranquility tranquility disappears, and he he starts writing poetry. When he is at ease, when he is at calm state, he thinks over those past experiences, those feelings he that comes to his mind. And when this tranquility disappears, he start sorry start writing poetry. So that is how this poetry originates. Function of poetry. What is function of poetry? As a poet, the poet is possessed of a greater power to feel his feelings than other person. A poet has a special quality. He says that he he can feel the feelings better than the other person, a normal person. The poet's feelings are saner, purer, and more permanent than can be aroused by the same object in other person. The poet is saner according to Wordsworth, purer, and it can rouse than the other person. So the reader is induced to feel the poet's way, the same situation, and the reader emerges saner and pure than before. When he reads the poem, the reader also becomes saner and purer as he reads the poems written by the poet. Poetry is the pursuit of truth, of man's knowledge of himself and the world around him. Wordsworth finds the truth of science and poetry different from him. According to him, science discovers material truths. According to Wordsworth, science discovers material truths, whereas poetry discovers metaphysical and physical truths. And the truth of science and truth of poetry is different. He says science discovers only materialistic truths, and poetry discovers metaphysical and physical truths. Wordsworth says poetry is the breadth and finer spirit of all knowledge. That's very important perspective in point of view of net exams and other competitive exams. That who said Wordsworth says that poetry is the breadth and finer spirit of all knowledge. It is impassioned impression which is the countenance of all science. Wordsworth's object and writing poetry was to console the afflicted. The objective of writing poetry, according to Wordsworth, was to console the afflicted, to add sunshine to daylight by making the happy happier, to teach the young and the gracious to every age to seek, to think and feel, and therefore to become more active and securely virtuous. It is to think, to feel, and therefore become more actively and securely virtuous, according to Wordsworth. He believed that every great poet is a teacher. I wish either to be considered as teacher or as nothing. That's a very important quote by Wordsworth, where he says that every great poet is a teacher. Every great poet is a teacher. I wish either to be considered as teacher or as nothing. So this is all about William Wordsworth criticism. Basically, in the criticism of William Wordsworth, he describes or talks about delineates, expresses about two things in poetic diction and theory of poetry, and these are the two basic points where he writes his criticism is based on. So this is all about criticism of William Wordsworth. Thanks for watching this video. Thanks for watching. Thank you.